Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Cwm Garon by L.T.C. Rolt. After a long winter spent in the fog and grime of London, this Welsh borderland was balm to the eye. Spring had only just touched the soot-blackened trees in the squares with lightest film of green, but here she had already run riot, dressing the whole countryside in fresh splendour. So thought John Carfax, as the labouring branch-line train bore him slowly over the last stage of his long journey to Wales. The map lay disregarded on his knee as he watched the moving panorama of hills stippled with April cloud shadows, of neat farms buried in the white mist of fruit orchards, and of rich meadows dotted with sheep or the red cattle of Herefordshire. He was in that mood of exhilaration and heightened perception which only a well-earned and long-awaited holiday in new surroundings can awaken, and he sniffed delightedly at the limpid air, crystal-like as spring water, yet somehow filled with unidentifiable sweetness, which blew in through the open window. He was alone in the compartment now, but it had evidently been market day in the town where he had left the London Express, for the little train standing at the bay platform had been filled with country folk. Black-gaitered farmers and their plump basket-laden wives had all gone, but still he seemed to smell sheep-dip and carbolic, to hear the lilt of their border speech, and to see the lithe Welsh sheepdog which sat between his master's legs, regarding him with wall-eyed suspicion. The rhythm of wheels of a rail joint slowed, and Carfax could tell from the labouring exhaust beats of the engine that they were climbing steeply. A chasm-like cutting hewn through the old red sandstone cut off the view, and plunged the compartment into sudden twilight. As suddenly the train emerged, and with a hollow reverberation crossed a swift mountain torrent before swinging round a curve so sharp that the wheel flanges grunted and squealed in protest. As it did so, the carriage window framed a picture which made Carfax start and catch his breath in wonder. So startling was it in its wild grandeur after looking so long at the smooth fields and hills of England. A towering mountain wall had suddenly arisen to enclose the whole western horizon, and to dominate and dwarf the familiar landscape of the foreground. Seen thus against the westering light of late afternoon, the shadowed face of this great massif presented so marked a contrast to the sunlit levels below as to seem unreal and as menacing as a thundercloud. So impenetrable was the shadow on the mountain that its contours were invisible, and the long level line of the ridge, sharply etched across the sky's brightness, appeared to mark the lip of a precipice, the height of which seemed monstrously magnified. Reluctantly, John Carfax turned his attention from the window to the map. Then, as he felt the brakes applied, he got up and lifted his rucksack down from the luggage rack. This must be Pont Newydd. He would have to step out if he was to cross the mountain and reach the inn at Llangaron Abbey by nightfall. A good map reader, he had no doubt of his ability to find his way through strange country by daylight, but to be overtaken by darkness on an open mountain was a very different matter. He welcomed the prospect of the long, hard walk after the inactivity of the train journey, and set off at a smart pace up the narrow road from the station. Behind him, he heard the train pant heavily out of earshot. It seemed to symbolize the last link between him and the civilization he had so lately left. And as he turned to glance at the thin plume of steam fast vanishing into the distance, he felt something of the sensation a voyager feels when landed on some remote, far distant island. He sees the ship that has brought him fade over the horizon. He experienced momentarily a strange feeling of loneliness, realizing that the train was an intruder from that world of elaborate artifice by means of which man had shut himself away from the eternal world of earth and sky, as though fearful of their elemental mystery. It had ruffled a still pool of silence, but now the last ripples died away into stillness, until there remained no sounds but his own footfall, a distant rumour of birdsong, and the sibilant voice of the little brook which ran beside the road. He had been walking for the best part of an hour before he came in sight of the first of the landmarks he had previously noted on his map. A grey, ruined tower, sat upon a conical mound and surrounded by a ditch. He conjectured correctly that it was one of the border keeps erected by the Norman Lords Marcher in their efforts to subdue the Silurians of the mountains. Here, turning off the metalled road into a rutted, high-banked lane, he set his face toward the mountain wall, which had hitherto marched on his left hand. Pressing on, he passed by 2 small whitewashed farms, where sheep-dogs ran out to bark and sniff at his heels. But though the lane climbed continuously, the skyline of the ridge seemed to retreat elusively before him. At length, however, he emerged onto a level plateau, treeless except for a few stunted thorn bushes, and patterned by crumbling, dry stone walls which had proved powerless to resist the downward march of the bracken. Here he came within the mountain's shadow, so that his eyes could, for the first time, penetrate its darkness to discern the steep diagonal path which scaled the ridge. Following its upward course, he could see, too, the shallow notch cut in the skyline of the ridge which marked the pass, if pass it could be called, for his map told him that the path climbed almost to the 2,000-feet contour. The premature dusk of the shadow spurred him on, and he soon passed through a rickety gate onto the open mountain, and was tackling the steep ascent. Pausing on the breakneck path to regain his breath, he turned and saw that already the plateau, which had seemed so high and windswept, now looked insignificant, merging imperceptibly into a vast checkerwork of field and copse, whose folds this height had now smoothed out. He plodded on, and had nearly reached the summit before he stopped, and turned again to find that the familiar landscape had shrunk to a remote perspective, while the evening sunlight on the farther fields looked pallid and unreal, as though seen through a veil. Glancing about him, he saw the reason. A white wall of cloud was rolling along the ridge out of the northwest, and in the next instant the scene below was lost in swirling mist. No rain fell, but his rough tweed jacket was soon pearled with beads of moisture, while a chill wind blew about him. The sudden coming of the mist brought with it a feeling of utter isolation, intensifying the loneliness he had felt when he left the station. It seemed to mark a further stage in some inexorable progress designed deliberately to cut him off from the familiar world of his fellow men. Sole occupant of a minute island of mountain turf, heather, and whinberry, that familiar world already seemed incredibly remote. Fortunately for him, the path was clearly defined, so that he was able to press on without pause or doubt. And as he did so, some curious trick of the silver light threw his shadow upon the white curtain before him, so that it seemed that a figure, monstrous yet tenuous as the mist itself, was leading him onward towards the summit of the pass. Watching it, he thought he could understand the stories he had heard of the creatures who were believed to haunt the mountain mists, and he felt he knew the terror that might come with this loneliness, as terror comes with darkness to the child. His heart seemed to beat in his ears like a muffled drum, for the stillness was intense. Even his footfall was muffled now by the resilient turf of the path. When, faint and far off, his ear caught the cry of a curlew, the sound brought no comforting sense of companionship, but by its plaintive wildness seemed only to accentuate the silence and the loneliness. Suddenly, the path swung right-handed, levelled out, and he found himself passing through a narrow defile, which he knew must mark the spine of the ridge. Immediately beyond the pass, the tracks skirted a mound pit, a hole from which peats had once been dug, but which had now become a quagmire ringed by livid green moss and tufted cotton grass. A luckless mountain pony had evidently floundered into it at some time, and, unable to extricate itself, had perished miserably. Now that ravens, crows, and mountain foxes had done their work, all that remained was a skeleton of whitened bones, wrapped in the hide as in a winding sheet. Carfax paused for a moment at this desolate sight, and as he did so the curlew cried again, nearer at hand this time, and the mist seemed to eddy more densely about him. He shivered involuntarily and went on, happy to find that the path was now leading him downwards as steeply as it had climbed. As he stumbled along, his feet pressing uncomfortably into the toes of his shoes, he noticed that the mist was now thinning, and that its whiteness was becoming suffused with golden light, although the invisible depths into which he was descending still seemed dark. Not only was he walking out of the mists, but the cloud itself appeared to be lifting, sweeping up the steep flank of the mountain like steam out of a cauldron, until, with breathtaking and dramatic suddenness, the veil which had imprisoned him and blinded him lifted like a curtain to reveal the whole wild prospect clearly before him. "You'll find the valley enchanting." He suddenly recalled the words of the friend who had first suggested this holiday, not in their original sense as a conversational overstatement, but with a new and strangely literal significance. He stood in the last stormy light of a sun that was just about to set behind the rim of yet another mountain ridge, which marched parallel with that upon which he stood, and which appeared to be of equal if not greater height. It could not be much more than a mile by crowflight, he judged, from ridge to ridge, yet between them yawned Cwm Garon, a stupendous furrow which, in the course of unnumbered centuries, the Afon Garon had carved into the heart of the mountains. Already this valley was wrapped in the blue shades of a premature twilight. Yet Carfax could sense, rather than see, the intense green of the meadows along the floor of the Cwm. Here and there lights gleamed from farmhouse windows. Faintly there rose into the thin mountain air the resinous incense of pinewood smoke and the murmur of the swiftly flowing river. At one point the valley widened into a natural amphitheatre, in the centre of which stood the grey shape of a building larger than a mountain farm. This Carfax took to be his destination, the ruined abbey of Llangaron and its adjoining inn. After the cloud-blinded solitude of the mountain-top, the sight of his goal raised his spirits to high good humour, and he strode on down the steep path at a great pace, his mind occupied with the prospect of a blazing fire, a well-earned dinner, and a foaming tankard. Great anticipations are often the prelude to disillusionment, but in this instance John Carfax was not disappointed. The dinner was excellent, and he gave a sigh of contentment as he stirred his coffee and extended his slippered feet towards the friendly flame of the log fire. Its warmth was welcome, for the spring nights were chilly in this valley, which the sun so soon forsook. In the opposite chimney corner, likewise toasting his toes, sat his only fellow guest at the inn. He was busily writing in what appeared to Carfax to be a large journal or diary which he balanced on his knee, and the tireless scratching of his pen mingled with the comfortable crackling of the fire and the occasional faint bubbling sound which Carfax's pipe made when he drew deeply. In London, he thought, it's never truly quiet, but here one becomes conscious of the slightest sound. He had exchanged generalities with his companion during their meal when they had sat together, but the latter had not been very forthcoming. He was much older than Carfax. In middle age he had obviously been a man of great strength, tall and broad in proportion. Now the wide shoulders stooped, and a suit of rough grey tweed hung loosely about his gaunt frame. Yet it was obvious that he was still very active, nor had his presence lost its power of command. A fine head of white hair and a short pointed beard meticulously trimmed made a fitting frame for the massive brow and the distinguished features. The most remarkable thing about these features, Carfax thought, were the eyes. Bright blue eyes, which had no need of glasses, and whose keenness quite belied his age. When he had spoken, he had regarded his fellow guest with a penetrating, unblinking gaze that was almost hypnotic in its intensity, and which, in a lesser man, would have seemed mere ill-mannered arrogance. Carfax found it disconcerting, for it gave him the impression that a keen intelligence, possessing a store of secret knowledge, was coolly taking the measure of his own mind, while it remained itself inscrutable, permitting him no such liberty. He recalled with a slight feeling of resentment that, whereas he had straightway introduced himself, the other had not responded similarly. He yawned and must have dozed, for he suddenly became conscious that the fire had burned lower and that the bowl of his pipe was cold. He hoped that he had not snored, and glanced apprehensively at his companion. If he had, it would seem that his bad manners had passed unnoticed, for the other's head was still bent over his book, and his pen travelled imperturbably on. He glanced at his watch. The hour was not late, but the long journey, the keen air, and the warmth of the fire had told upon him, and his eyelids were heavy with sleep. He rose to go to bed, but before doing so, some chance impulse made him walk to the window, part the curtains, and look out. The night was clear, and a bright moon, near the full, rode above a rack of clouds, which was drifting like smoke from lip to lip of the defile. Yet, despite the swiftly moving clouds overhead, an absolute stillness held the valley, for the trees stood motionless. Only the unseen river, rushing over its rocky bed, sounded incessantly. The window looked directly up the roofless nave of the abbey, and the great columns threw upon the moonlit grass shadows so dense that the eye could scarcely distinguish image from substance. Beyond, above the site of the high altar, the great east window, devoid of tracery, framed the dark, brooding shape of the mountain which Carfax had crossed that evening. The scene was so extravagant in its chiaroscuro, so humiliating in its grandeur, that he could not restrain a muttered exclamation. "Oh, who will tell me where he found thee at that dead and silent hour? What hallowed, solitary ground did bear so rare a flower, within whose sacred leaves did lie the fullness of the deity?" It was appropriate that these lines of the Silurist should have sprung to his mind, for it was not surprising, he reflected, that this country should have been the inspiration of Vaughan and Traherne. Here, truly, heaven seemed nearer earth. And hell too, maybe. Carfax started, not only because the voice sounded close at his elbow, but because he was not aware that he had spoken his thoughts aloud. He realized that his taciturn companion had moved silently from his chair and was gazing out into the night with those strange, unblinking eyes of his. "Yes," he went on in a soft, ruminative tone, as though he were speaking more to himself than Carfax. "It is certainly very beautiful, so beautiful that it distills some influence, call it magic if you like, which turns men's minds from material to spiritual things. Unless I am much mistaken, it set you thinking of the Dominicans who built their great church in its solitude, and of the Silurists, Traherne and Vaughan." Carfax turned back into the room, letting the curtain fall across the window. The uncanny accuracy with which the other had read his thoughts disturbed him. His expression must have revealed this disquiet, for the other chuckled. "I must really apologize," he went on, "if I startled you. I can assure you I am not really such an accomplished thought-reader. Let me explain. I have visited this valley on numerous occasions, spread over a period of years, and I know that on first acquaintance it always casts this same spell over visitors who, like yourself, are gifted with imagination. All I have done was to observe in you the familiar symptoms." Carfax was somewhat mollified, though he felt slightly irritated by the other's self-assurance, and by the way in which he talked of what had been to him a profound spiritual experience, as though it were a cold in their head. Nevertheless, his companion's words had roused his curiosity. "What exactly do you mean by saying on first acquaintance?" he asked. "Are you suggesting that my present impression of Cwm Garon is likely to change? And what did you mean by your odd remark about hell?" "The first question first," replied the other. "If I have judged you correctly, then I think your impressions will change, but I don't propose to bias your mind by suggesting how that change may come or what form it will take. Explore the valley for yourself tomorrow, and then, if you should feel so disposed, I should be most interested to hear your views. As to your second question," he went on, I regret the remark, and do not know what prompted me to make it. I would prefer not to explain myself further for the moment, except to suggest that a belief in heaven implies a corresponding belief in hell. Despite renewed questioning, the older man refused to commit himself further, and it was a puzzled and thoughtful Carfax who eventually bid his fellow guest good night, lit his candle, and made his way up the narrow stone newel stair to his bed in the tower room. He slept soundly, rose early, and breakfasted alone. He was about to set out on his tour of exploration. In fact, he was standing in the hall of the inn packing sandwiches into his haversack, when he noticed the visitor's book and remembered that he had not yet signed it. As he turned the pages to remedy this omission, he discovered the identity of his fellow guest, for in the last occupied space was written Charles Elphinstone, Oxford, in a fluent, scholarly hand. The name seemed familiar, but for the life of him he couldn't place it. By the time he had reached the valley floor the previous night, darkness had prevented him from forming an adequate picture of his new surroundings, and now the weather conditions could scarcely have been less favourable. The portents of a stormy sunset and an ominously clear night had been fulfilled. The mountain walls upon either hand were hidden by a moving rack of clouds, whose tattered fringe had descended almost to the upper limit of the cultivated fields. A fine but deceptively penetrating rain was falling, and although occasional strong gusts of wind came eddying off the mountains, now from this direction, now from that, the air was humid and stifling. The swollen Garon and the innumerable small torrents cascading down. The swollen Garon and the innumerable small torrents cascading down the steep slopes filled the valley with the sound of falling water. Nevertheless, knowing how swiftly the mountain climate could change, Carfax was not unduly downcast, and, buttoning up the collar of his mackintosh, he set off resolutely up the valley. The lane was narrow and high-banked, and was never far away from the line of alder and hazel which overhung the shallow gorge through which the river flowed. He noticed that the small fields, both pasture and arable, looked clean and well-tended, their hedges neatly laid and trimmed, but he saw no one at work in them. The small farms seemed equally deserted, and had he not scented wood smoke as he passed them, he would have thought that they were empty. No doubt the weather accounted for this suspension of activity. It struck him as ironical that the only fellow mortal he encountered in the morning's solitude he passed by unawares. But only a chance glance over his shoulder had revealed the figure of a man, sheltering beneath a tree which he had lately passed. The man stood so still, and the old brown overcoat, together with the sack which he had thrown over head and shoulders against the wet, blended so exactly with the colour of the tree bole at his back that Carfax stopped for a moment to confirm his first glance. The man ignored his scrutiny, but when, at the bend of the road, he looked back again, he was no longer to be seen. He had been walking for the best part of an hour when he saw on the left of the road what he took to be the ruins of a church. The valley was narrower here, and its walls more precipitous, for the clouds revealed glimpses of naked crags and desolate screes of shattered boulders. As though these features had not already made the site of the church sombre enough, a dense belt of pine trees had been planted beside it. This must be In Cwm Garon, he reflected, recalling his study of the map during breakfast. He thought he had never seen so gloomy a place. It would seem dark even in the sunlight, and as the ruined church appeared to be of no architectural merit, he walked on. He conjectured that he must be nearing the head of the valley, for the lane grew rougher and commenced to climb steeply, until he presently gained the open mountain. The rain had stopped. The sky looked brighter ahead, while the clouds showed signs of lifting. The rain, the lowering clouds, and the oppressive humid warmth of the valley had between them damped his spirits, but now he stepped out cheerfully, a colder and drier wind in his face, which made him feel as one who passes into fresh night air out of some overheated room. By the time he had reached the head of the pass, and could look down on the great landscape of hill and vale spread out beneath him, there was blue sky overhead, and a moving pattern of sunlight and shadow was dappling the slopes of the mountains. Carfax felt very well content as he sat with his back against the sheltering boulder and munched his sandwiches. Not far away, a little group of mountain ponies were grazing, while high overhead a buzzard soared on moth-like wings. A shepherd was gathering his sheep off the north face of the mountain. Carfax could see his tiny foreshortened figure on the plateau far below, and his shrill 4-in-11 whistle as he worked his dogs borne up to him by the wind. These things brought a sense of life and companionship, dispelling the feeling of loneliness that had been growing upon him since he left the train on the previous day. He took out his map and checked his position. He had reached the central massif of the range. From it, the long ridges stretched southwards like the fingers of an outspread hand. Between them and to the west lay two valleys, the Llan Fawr and the Llan Fechan, running parallel with Cwm Garon. As the weather seemed to have set fair, and there was plenty of time, he decided he would walk back down the Llan Fawr valley, crossing the intervening ridge at a point well below Llan Garon, and so return to the inn by the opposite direction. He found that the valley of Llan Fawr was physically very similar to that of Cwm Garon. If anything, it was even narrower, while the mountain walls were equally high. Yet somehow the atmosphere of the place seemed quite different, more friendly, was the description which at once occurred to him. Obviously, the improvement in the weather must be responsible, he decided. This mountain country was strangely temperamental. Owing to the more restricted area of cultivated land, the small farms were spaced farther apart than those in Cwm Garon. Yet there seemed to be no lack of life and activity. A hedger at work beside the lane, and a swarthy individual leading a pack of gemiettes with pack saddles bid him a lilting good day as he passed. In one farmyard, 3 small children paused from play to stare round-eyed as he went by, while in a nearby field, sown with oats, a farmer was working a 2-horse roll. Finally, just before he turned off the road to climb back over the ridge, he met a woman driving 3 cows to the evening milking. When he had finished the climb and begun the steep ascent, the sun was still lighting the fields on the farther side of Cwm Garon, but he noticed that they looked just as deserted as they had done that morning. There still seemed to be neither sight nor sound of any activity. Silence seemed to well up from the valley like water from a spring. In fact, the distant murmur of the Garon seemed to symbolize and accentuate it. He began to recall all the small workaday noises which he had heard but not remarked in Llan Fawr, and the lower he descended, the louder his footfalls seemed to sound. Despite the sunlight and the clear air, he found the feeling of loneliness and of strange oppression inexplicably returning. There was a sense of menacing constriction about the towering walls which hemmed in this valley and cut him off from the outer world, and yet, after his experience in Llan Fawr, he knew that it could not merely be a case of claustrophobia. He had not gone far along the road back to Llan Garon when he came inside of a small public house and decided that a glass of beer would dispel this curious illusion that the valley was deserted. The dim, low-ceilinged room, there was no bar, was snug and spotless. The stone-flagged floor looked newly scrubbed, and the dark polished surfaces of the table, settle and high-backed Welsh dresser, caught the light of the cheerful fire which burned in the hob grate. But the room was empty and silent, save for the small settling sounds of the fire and the measured ticking of the grandfather clock. Carfax coughed and scuffed his feet on the flags. A latch clicked in the back of the house, and as the unseen door opened, he heard a deep rumble of male voices. A woman appeared, and when she had fetched his drink, he made some trivial pleasantry, but she seemed either shy or taciturn, for she answered in monosyllables, and after standing awkwardly for a moment, retired again to what he imagined to be the kitchen. The indistinguishable murmur of male talk went on. Carfax took a deep and gratifying draught, and then stooped to knock out his pipe in the ashtray. As he did so, he realized that the dottle already in the tray was warm, and the cigarette stub beside it was still smouldering. Looking round the room curiously, he then saw that a man's cap lay in the chimney corner of the settle, and that 2 gnarled hazel sticks were propped against the wall near the door. At any other time and place, Carfax would not have observed such trivialities, and even if he had, he would have attached no importance to them. But now they bred in him a disquieting suspicion which refused to be dispelled. It was that his approach had been discreetly observed by the late occupants of the room, and that for reasons best known only to themselves, they had retreated to the kitchen. The uncomfortable feeling of unwelcome intrusion which this suspicion prompted scarcely encouraged him to linger. The room seemed to have grown suddenly hostile, so much so that he did not even pause to refill his pipe, but drained his glass and set out once more upon his way. The sunlight had now crept away from the fields, so that although the highest slopes of the eastern ridge were still suffused with golden light, the shadows in the valley were already thickening into twilight. His experience at the inn had exerted a curious influence over his mind, he discovered, for although the farms he passed seemed as still and deserted as those he had seen that morning, they no longer gave him the impression of being uninhabited. On the contrary, he imagined that every window concealed a watcher, that every house was the centre of some intense and secret life, which at his approach was instantly suspended. The farther he went, the more certain did he become that his very movement was the subject of furtive scrutiny. Yet it was a certainty which his reason was powerless either to confirm or to disprove. Time and again he would stop and look back quickly, hoping to surprise the swaying of a curtain, the movement of a door, or to see in the shadow of a tree or hedge some tangible shape. He looked in vain, yet the feeling and the fear continued to grow upon him, despite his senses' negative evidence. It was no longer confined to the houses he passed, and to the people who might or might not lurk within them. It was a fear distilled by the valley itself. The brooding mountains, the still pines, even the heavy windless air itself seemed to have suspended some secret activity to join in this silent and malign watch. As he walked resolutely on, fear stalked at his elbow, and he felt as if he was the focal point of some great burning glass of hostile forces. Just as the first lightning flash and thunderclap puts a welcome end to the breath-baiting suspense that precedes the storm, Carfax found himself wishing that something, however fearful, might happen. But no material event took place, and he reached the inn at Llangaron in good time for dinner. In the cheerful light of the dining room, he felt inclined to dismiss the matter as so much hallucination, but he could not deny that, as his fellow guest had prophesied, his first impression of the valley had undergone radical revision. "Well," queried Elphinstone as they drew their chairs to the fire after dinner, "what's the verdict now?" Carfax hesitated. Considered in retrospect, his fears seemed so intangible and groundless that he felt foolish and doubted his ability to express them in so many words. With the other's encouragement, however, he presently gave as detailed and faithful an account of his day as he was able. During his narration, Elphinstone nodded occasionally, but seemed to evince no surprise. When Carfax had finished speaking, he remained silent for a few moments, pulling at a thin black cheroot. "Interesting," he said at length, "very interesting, but not, I can assure you, a unique experience by any means. For years, I might safely say for centuries, strangers have been made aware, by some such means as you describe, that they were not welcome in this valley." But it's not just the people," put in Carfax. "It's as though the valley—" I know, the older man cut him short. "It's not as simple as that, is it? 'An angel satyr walks these hills,'" he quoted. "You know who wrote that? Why, Kilvert, angel satyr, a curious association of opposites. What do you suppose induced a mild little Victorian curate to use such a term? I think I can understand now, Carfax admitted, and yet, he went on, I refuse to believe that this sense of evil is a natural emanation of the place itself. As a Christian, I hold that both good and evil are human concepts, and that they do not exist in nature. Well put, said the other, and probably true, but if, as a Christian, you believe that there are spiritual as well as material powers, then don't you think it possible that man might abuse and pervert the former no less than the latter? Carfax nodded. Yes, he agreed thoughtfully. I suppose such a thing is possible. I am sure of it, Elphinstone went on, and what's more, I consider that this valley can prove my contention. Go on, prompted Carfax. I believe, the other continued, that some evil force dominates Cwm Garon. I think it is a natural force which man in some remote time released and harnessed to some perverted ends. For centuries this dark power has been, as it were, dammed up in this valley until it has soaked into the very stones of the place. That is why a more superficial mind than yours might imagine that it is a natural phenomenon. Outside interference has an effect upon it like that of a stone flung into a still pool. That's why Cwm Garon and its people have always implacably resisted intrusion. He paused. But is that really so? Queried Carfax. What evidence have you? Apart from many similar experiences to your own, the older man replied, there is ample historical evidence. Take this abbey, for instance. He made a sweeping gesture. It did not survive until the dissolution. What happened? The community dwindled. Its numbers could not be maintained. Finally, a new abbey of Garon was built in the safe flatlands beside the Wye, and the old was abandoned. It has been said that it was too solitary, too open to attack by wolves or raiding hillmen. Do you find that explanation convincing? Do you think that a church which deliberately sought the solitudes, and which established flourishing communities at such places as Vallecrucis or Strata Florida, would be defeated merely by the loneliness of Cwm Garon? No. I suggest that they went because they feared something more potent, but less tangible than wolves or robbers. You say you saw the ruined church at Capel Cwm Garon. Do you know the history of that? It was built by a 19th century religious sect, headed by a man who called himself Brother Jeremy. What happened? History repeated itself. The community dwindled. Misfortune followed misfortune. The eventual result you've seen for yourself. It's not only the efforts of the church that have failed, he went on. On the slope of the mountain just behind here, you'll find the ruins of a house. There's not much to see, but it's all that's left of the place that Alaric Stevenson, the artist, tried to build for himself. I say tried, because it was never finished. He apparently had some grandiose notion that he was going to make a sort of miniature paradise for himself here, but he soon found out he was mistaken. Everything went wrong. No local contractors would work for him. What was done during the day was undone at night. Even the trees he tried to plant were uprooted. I could quote several other examples of the same kind of thing, but the repetition would be boring. But do these forces manifest themselves in any way? Questioned Carfax. That depends, was the answer. Unless you deliberately seek them or try to interfere with them, I should say, no. You might stay here a month without experiencing any more than the sense of hostility and surveillance which you felt today. Elphinstone rose to his feet and lit the candle on the side table. What is this extraordinary influence, and how exactly does it influence the people who live in Cwm Garon? Carfax persisted. The other was standing in the doorway about to bid him good night. His keen eyes glittered in the flickering candle flame as he smiled and shook his head. I cannot answer that question, he replied, at least not yet. I think I have a shrewd idea, but one day, soon, perhaps, I hope to know. The conversation had filled Carfax's head with disturbing speculations, and despite his long day in the mountain air, it was some time before he lost consciousness. Even so, it must have been a light doze instead of his usual sound sleep, for he presently awoke, and glancing at the luminous dial of his wristwatch, saw that it was nearly midnight. He became aware of a stealthy movement in the room overhead at the top of the tower, movement betrayed by sounds so slight that he could never have detected them but for the profound stillness. Then he heard the pad of stealthy feet descending the stone stairs. A thin pencil of light flickered momentarily beneath his door and was gone. Carfax climbed softly out of the bed and crossed to the open window. He was in time to see a tall, slightly stooping figure, which he recognized unmistakably as that of Charles Elphinstone, cross the grass below and disappear beyond the ruined wall of the cloister garth. As he watched, he suddenly recalled the association of the name which had eluded him all day. Professor Charles Elphinstone, probably the greatest authority on folklore and magic since Fraser. One day, soon perhaps, I hope to know. He seemed to hear an echo of his last words. Though Carfax was by no means of a timid disposition, he felt a reluctant, even envious feeling of admiration for the intrepid old man. Admittedly, on the face of it, a midnight stroll in this quiet Welsh valley seemed to call for no particular display of courage. The night was clear and brightly moonlit, the scene the same as before, the same black shadows of the nave arches on the dew-laden grass, the same black grandeur of mountains framed in the gaping east window, the same stillness. Yet this time Carfax had no thought of Vaughan or Traherne, for he knew the fear that lurked in this silence. Were those lights moving and dancing along the slopes of the mountains, or was it merely a trick of moonlight shining upon stone? Somewhere near at hand, an owl hooted mournfully. And there came into his mind a line from the 13th chapter of Isaiah. Owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there. He shivered and returned to the welcome warmth of the bed. The professor did not appear at breakfast. Doubtless he was making up for lost sleep, thought Carfax, but the reflection could not dispel a vague sense of uneasiness which refused to be quieted. He deliberately loitered in the dining room, hoping Elphinstone would come. When at 10:30 his place was still empty, Carfax determined to settle his fears. He climbed the tower stairs to the professor's room. A can stood outside his door. It was full, and the water was quite cold. He knocked softly, then more loudly. There was no response. Turning the handle very gently, he opened the door a few inches and looked in. The room was empty. Some instinct prompted Carfax to set out on his search in the same direction as he had taken the previous day, towards the ruined church of L Cwm Garon. He was still trying to reassure himself that his fears were groundless, though Elphinstone had not, it appeared, warned the inn of any intended absence. He might well have decided to stay out on such a fine morning, while even involuntary absence might be caused by no worse mishap than a sprained ankle. Yet a feeling of foreboding would not be appeased. He realized that the date was May the 1st, that last night, in fact, had been the Eve of May, of ancient celebration, and somehow this knowledge by no means allayed his concern. Meanwhile, his senses observed the same atmosphere of hostility and watchfulness, but now, preoccupied with fresh fears, he no longer turned to peer at vacant windows or into the shadows beneath the trees, knowing that to do so would be fruitless. So he strode on until he came in sight of the crags of Black Darren, which towered above the ruined church. As his eyes roamed over the precipice, he thought he detected a movement among the boulders of the screes below. He fumbled for his binoculars and focused them hurriedly. 2 men appeared to be bending over something, which lay behind a rock invisible to him. No doubt a sheep's fallen from the crags, whispered reason, but dread lent wings to his feet. Professor Charles Elphinstone had obviously slipped and fallen from a great height in attempting to scale the crags, and his body lay against the rock in that attitude of macabre abandonment which betokens shattered bones. His hat had fallen off, and the luxuriant white hair was matted with congealed blood. Carfax, who was familiar with death in many forms, was not dismayed by these gruesome commonplaces of violent dissolution. What drained the blood from his face and impelled him to quickly replace the sack which covered the body was the expression on the face. He would not have believed that the features he had lately seen, so calm and confident, could have been moulded by terror to such hideous contortion. It may be thought that Carfax would have no desire ever to revisit the valley. He would certainly have subscribed to this view himself when he left Llangharon on the day following the tragic accident. Everything about Cwm Garon had become repulsive to him, and, as many others, it seemed, had done before him, he retired defeated. Never did the mundane environment of the outside world seem so friendly and welcoming. When the train pulled into the little station at Pont Newydd, he could scarcely resist the impulse to run up to the footplate and shake the driver by the hand. Yet, and to those who have ever visited Cwm Garon, this will seem the most improbable part of the strange story, as the weeks went by after his return to London, fear turned to curiosity, and repulsion to an attraction which he found increasingly difficult to resist. It was almost as though some powerful influence was luring him back. Be that as it may, Carfax did return to the valley, and a sultry night on the eve of August the 1st found him once again walking up the lane toward Capel Cwm Garon. The heat in the valley that day had been stifling. Everything had felt hot to the touch, and the outlines of the mountain ridges shimmered in a haze which mingled with the acrid smoke of a heather fire. Never had the atmosphere seemed so surcharged with still suspense. Even the interminable voice of the Garon had been muted by weeks of drought. Only occasionally, far away over the mountains towards Radna, faint thunder growled and muttered. At evening, a grey veil of cloud had spread slowly across the sky so that the night felt black and starless. Yet the heat was still insufferable, and there was no breath of wind. Everything, from the towering mountain to individual leaf or grass blade, seemed poised in tense expectancy, as though awaiting some tremendous event. I will not attempt to analyze Carfax's state of mind as he strode on through the dark of the high-banked lane. Though still beyond the reach of his five senses, his reason no longer questioned the reality of a malign, unsleeping watch. Yet still, for lust of knowing what should not be known, he held on purposefully. Somewhere above the invisible crags of the Black Darren, a heather fire was still burning, a livid wheel of flickering flame twisting snake-like across the face of the mountain. But Carfax also saw other lights in the darkness, moving points of light which no comfortable theory could explain. They appeared to move swiftly along and down the mountain walls, converging, it would seem, upon the church at Capel Cwm Garon. There must, he thought, be another fire just beyond the church, for the ruined walls were visible against its dull red glare. As he approached more closely, however, he saw, with a new fear stirring in his heart, that he was mistaken, and that the light was actually coming from the church itself. While fascination fought with terror within him, he drew nearer, leaving the lane for the short turf of the field where his footfalls made no sound, until he reached a position from which he could see into the roofless nave. In the centre of the church stood a brazier which glowed redly and sent up swirling clouds of smoke, whose pungent aromatic odour drifted across to where Carfax stood. Around and about the brazier moved a considerable company of men and women. They were naked, and as they moved, their bodies seemed to capture and reflect the ruddy glare of the fire as though they were lacquered. When he glimpsed them momentarily in the firelight, Carfax thought that the faces of a few of the taller ones seemed vaguely familiar, but the majority of the company appeared to be very short in stature, so short, in fact, that at the first instant of vision he thought they must be children. Their bodies, however, belied this impression, as did their faces, for their countenances were such that Carfax was grateful for the smoke, which prevented him from seeing them clearly. Sometimes the company moved in slow and stately dance. Sometimes the pace quickened to a frenzy accompanied by gesture and posture indescribably obscene. Naked feet moved silently, and there was no sound of music, yet always they seemed obedient to the measure of some inaudible rhythm. Now and again the smoke whirled aside to reveal in the shadows beyond the brazier a horned figure seated upon some kind of throne. Carfax marked this inhuman shape with a renewed access of fear, until he realized that it was a man clothed in skins and wearing a horned headdress. He knew then that he was beholding the celebration of rites unbelievably ancient, and temporarily his interest overcame his revulsion and his fear, but only momentarily, for it dawned upon him that this spectacle, for all its diabolic depravity, was human, and that it inspired a purely physical emotion, whereas the malignant power which brooded over the valley itself was something more or less than human. These forms, which writhed in the firelight, might conjure or appease that power, but they were not the power itself. Their monstrous celebration had not abated the tense expectancy of the stillness. The valley still awaited some greater event. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning, followed immediately by a crash of thunder, tore through the veil of darkness and silence. Reverberating like great drums, the mountains took up the roar of sound and flung it from wall to wall, echoing and re-echoing down Cwm Garon. The figures round the fire had ceased their dance and flung themselves prostrate on the floor. The fire itself burnt low. The thunder died away with a sound like the closing of some vast door, and with its passing there seized Carfax a terror of the soul so abject that it was as though the valley yawned like the mouth of hell. For there fell about him a silence that was like the soundless desolation of outer space, and a sightless darkness blacker than any midnight. Though his eyes were blinded and his ears heard no sound, he knew that there stalked through the valley something intangible, unearthly, monstrous, and very terrible. Though no leaf moved, something stirred in his hair. It seemed to pass as a storm cloud passes, sweeping down Cwm Garon, and with that passage the spell which had bound senses and held limbs from motion lifted. Carfax screamed, and slipping and stumbling, he ran towards the crags of Black Darren. At the sound of his voice, two squat figures left the circle around the fire. Their pale forms glimmered in the darkness as they followed lithely after, moving in swift silence over the screes. Hi, so this is Tony Walker, and thank you for listening to that story, which goes out on Spotify and on Apple and on YouTube. If you would like ad-free stories, please come across to my Patreon, which is www.patreon.com/Barcud, Barcud. And we have a library there of like 400 ghost stories, supernatural stories, which you can download. and you can do what you want with them. You can listen to them at your leisure, and there are no ads. That's the key selling point. I'm grateful for you being here on whichever platform you're on, and Spotify and YouTube do share ad revenue with me. And so I'm grateful for that. But if you prefer to have no ads, then, it'll be great to see you over on Patreon. Patreon.com/BARCUD. Thank you very much. So that story was Cwm Garon by L.T.C. Rolt, born 1910, 1974. And I should just acknowledge that was supported, gratefully acknowledge as well, that was supported by Gavin Critchley. Now, you may know that Gavin supports me every quarter, every 3 months. He gives me some cash to pay for a story, and I say to him, what do you want? And sometimes he says, I'll leave it to you, and other times he's got definite ideas about what he wants. And this time he'd said he'd really enjoyed the Tom Rolt story that we did, Horsley Bank Foundry. I've done quite a few Tom Rolts, and I'm a big fan of Tom Rolt, so it's a great conjunction of both Gavin's interests and mine that we both like Tom Rolt. So I'd just like to thank once again Gavin for sponsoring this episode, and if anybody else wants to do it, that's great as well. And he does it, so we do four episodes a year, are Gavin Critchley episodes, and this is one of them. So I've done Tom Rolt stories before, so as normal, I'm just going to say something about him. You may have heard it before. So he was born in Chester, on the Welsh borders, in the Welsh Marches, on the 11th of February 1910, into a family of engineers, and he went to Cheltenham College and briefly at Keble College, Oxford. He turned away from formal study to hands-on life with machines, waterways and words. So he's a really interesting character, because mainly you don't think of engineers as being wordsmiths, or wordsmiths as being engineers, writers. I mean, people, they write technical manuals, but you know what I mean. He's a very lyrical writer. I came across him through a couple of things, really. You may know that I love the canals, as he did. I quite like railways. My dad was a big railway fan. My stepfather was a big railway fan. He had a model railway upstairs, which I wasn't allowed to play with because it was too good. But I used to love watching it. I couldn't touch it because boys are so destructive, and which is true. And so anyway, so Tom Rolt was that mix of writer and preservationist and engineer. He had a real soul for it, He wasn't one of these he wasn't necessarily a futurist. I mean, he was interested in machines, but he was interested in the Industrial Revolution and the history and the tradition of machines and machinery. So he inevitably became a preservationist, both of canals and of railways. He wrote a book called Narrowboat, 1954, which I found in a charity shop, which is a fantastically lyrical evocation of deciding the history of the canals. As I've said before, they were a great industrial revolution thing. They were designed to move goods more effectively around Britain to supply the industrial revolution. So there was canal mania, a lot of them by Irish navvies who died in their thousands to build this canal network. In England, there are canals in Ireland, there are canals in Scotland, there are canals in Wales, but the canal network mainly, in terms of miles, is in England. Yeah, I mean, they're in France as well. And then by the time that Rolt came along in the 20th century, they'd been overtaken by the railways and then the motorways, and they were in decline. They were being closed. They were silting up. And he decided to live on a narrow boat because there were a whole culture of families like this water gypsy culture of people who lived on boats moving cargo, and they were proper solid grafters. They weren't hippies or dreamers or poets. They were working people, but they had their own culture, their own style of painting. Each canal has its own style of painting on the boats. Massive culture to it, but it was dying out. So Rolt, who was a romantic, I suppose, got married and converted an old working boat into a home. And this book, Narrowboat, published in 1944, is a eulogy to that life. And I remember one story, and this is still like in England, which has disappeared really, and it's a summer, and he and his wife are on the boat, and they go down this canal, and there's meadow sweet and all sorts, and larks, maybe not larks, but, birds. Funnily enough, we were on a canal in autumn, and there were loads of plum trees. This was in the Midlands. This was near Coventry. And there were loads of plum trees, ripe plums, and the boaters had planted a lot of fruit trees along the canals in certain places, so they would be there as a supply of food. But in this particular one, old Tom Rolt and his wife, they go to this inn in the days before they had bars. I think in this story, the pub he goes to doesn't have a bar. And I just remember pubs like that. There's one in High Harrington called the Plough and Horses, I think. And it was, you went into a room and you sat there, and a woman came and she poured you ale. We were illegally drinking in those times. We were probably about 16, 17. In any case, so in this story, the narrowboat, he goes into the countryside and they have this meal of bread and cheese and beer. You know, that real, talk about the American dream, but that is the English dream, and it's, they walk on this waterway and they cross a river on stepping stones, and they find an old medieval church, and it's a proper trip, man. Anyway, he founded, after Narrowboat, there was a real movement. He inspired a movement and he helped found the Inland Waterways Association in 1946 to cherish, to restore, to preserve the canal network. And then his second thing was the railways, and he helped rescue the Llanelli railway in Merionethshire in Wales, a slightly different place. This is I reckon this is Radnorshire. I think it's in Brecconshire or somewhere like that. It comes across the border from Herefordshire, and this is an area that I used to work in at times many years ago. And I'm going to talk a little bit about folk horror a bit later, but so he was sympathetic and loved the whole countryside and the Welsh countryside as well as the English countryside. So the other thing that he did was write supernatural stories. Now, he got involved with Robert Aikman, another writer of strange stories and another organizer. After reading Narrowboat, Aikman wrote to Rolt, and together they launched the Inland Waterways Association. Aikman was the chairman and Rolt as honorary secretary, and they had rallies, campaigns, and they did a fantastic job. It was very creative, but they were different by temperament. Aikman wanted every single waterway kept open, and Rolt, who had a great loyalty to traditional canal communities and was more a realist about what was possible, he argued to prioritise. They fell out, and there was the famous 1950 Market Harbour rally, and by early 1951, Aikman forced Rolt out. The Aikman and the Waterways is really interesting, and Rolt, and of course Elizabeth Jane Howard, who wrote a fantastic canal story called 3 Miles Up, which, look it up, it's a great story. She had an affair with Aikman. I don't think she had an affair with Rolt. So there we are. Amazing guy, really, Tom Rolt. And if you listen a lot, I think we did the Garside Fell disaster, which is a railway story, and we did the Holybank Foundry, which is about an ironworks, and we did Bosworth Pound Summit, which is a canal story, and this has a railway in it. But it's a proper piece of folk horror, So Rolt is a fantastic guy. I'm a massive fan of his. I just got a copy of his autobiography, again in a second-hand store. It's massive, though. And he wrote it, and it was later published by his late wife. Not by his wife, not his late wife. Later published by his wife, who is now late, if you know what I mean. So fantastic stuff, really. Okay, so what do I want to say about the story? And I don't want to say tremendous amount. It is your classic folk horror, isn't it? So your classic folk horror is, and there are a couple of things I many times talk about the Gothic and the other. So one feature of the Gothic is the strangeness, and this is related to this whole idea of making supernatural stories more believable by placing them at a distance. And of course, M.R. James famously said this, the veil. So you can either put them in the past or you can put them in a remote place. And this is done all the time. This happens in the Gothic novel, of course, which is set in Carinthia and Italy, which was very exotic in the 18th century to the British people. And
And we see it coming on later, and then we get like the folk horror movies in the 1970s, which are set in during the English Revolution, the English Civil War, and the Great Revolution afterwards. Great, really interesting period of history, very radical period of history, which was sat upon, of course, as always happens, But so we do it in the past. So, and I've spoken also about how for the mass of the reading public who were urban and lived where most people live, they live in the towns of the South and Midlands of England to an extent, sort of like Leeds and potentially Newcastle as well. But if you draw a line of the population of the UK, more than half of it is south of Birmingham. But I mean, if we include Birmingham and Great Midlands cities there as well, and the southeast of England, and London, particularly London, the great beast. I love London, but it is a great beast. And in terms of the UK. But, so there we have it. So the Celtic countries, so the Highlands of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, they become the folk horror other. So no longer do we have to go to Transylvania or Corinthia. We can have these weirdly Celtic places, with this purported Celtic myth, the Celtic mist, which to be fair was played up a fair bit by the Celts themselves. You think of Macpherson's Ossian and Yeats's Celtic Twilight and Aris Thomas, case in point. But there we are. But there isn't enough time to talk about Aris Thomas, great man, very difficult man, funnily enough. But there we are. Never wrote in Welsh, although he learned Welsh. He was from the Welsh borders, but he learned Welsh and then was a priest in Llyn or Efionydd, I think, and very keen on the Welsh language, and spoke Welsh, of course, but never wrote in Welsh, interestingly. There we are. So folk horror, it's absolutely folk horror. We have, and in a sense, you see this as a bit of an homage to Arthur Machen. Now, Arthur Machen is a Gwent man, so he's writing about what is Monmouthshire and, I suppose, the eastern parts of Glamorgan, and that's his patch, and also the border country shading into Herefordshire and fantastic Gloucestershire, fantastic part of the world. I'm going to do part of the Offa's Dyke walk this year. I'm hoping to plan it to walk from Chepstow, probably just as far as Montgomery, I think, because it's about 200 miles, so I've probably only got time to do 100 miles. I'm probably going to do it on my own as well, which I'm really looking forward to. But that's going to be April, that's by the by. But it goes through this countryside. It skirts the Black Mountains, and that part of Brecconshire there. I've got lots of things to say about that thing, and we go further east. I was often in Llanwrtyd Wells and places like that, and Bilth and places like that, in Brecon itself in days gone by. And there's a friend of mine, Tom Morris, who his father's family are from there, and the Epint, and he did a fantastic album recently, and there's a great line from a guy up at Epint up there who says in Welsh, "Dalir edig tipyn bach." So he's an old guy who's still ploughing. So very nostalgic. But anyway, I've wandered as usual. But Arthur Machen, very much the white people. A weirder take on it. Rolt's is more straightforwardly folk horror. This could have happened in Cornwall, could have happened in Yorkshire, could have happened in Cumbria, could have happened in the Scottish Highlands, whereby, the urbanite goes and there are these dour, unfriendly, and of course, if you live in the UK, and particularly if you live in England, what you'll find is that the Welsh have a reputation of being unfriendly, and people say things like, they don't speak Welsh unless you go there, which is nonsense, of course. I remember once walking along the prom in Aberystwyth years ago with Tom Morris, and there were these people from the Midlands. We were speaking Welsh, and we had this guy going, "It's just the gobbledygook they like to speak," as if it didn't mean anything. My only experience, obviously I'm from Cumbria, so I've got an English accent. But the only time in my whole years of living in Wales that I ever had anything like that, there were two occasions whereby once I was working in an archaeological dig in Larne in in Carmarthenshire. Now, Larne, even at the time I was doing it, I didn't really speak much Welsh. Larne's famous for being Dylan Thomas's place. And of course, Dylan Thomas, his father was a Welsh teacher, but he never taught Dylan Welsh, except in the census. I think in 1931 census, something like that. Dylan Thomas, there's a question, do you speak Welsh? And he puts yes. So he did. He did speak Welsh, Dylan Thomas. But again, like R.S. Thomas, he didn't write in Welsh. Now, anyway, Larne, fantastic place. If you should go there, it's great. And we were doing an archaeological dig on the castle there. And every night we would go to the pub, which was the thing about archaeologists. They dig during the day, go to the pub at night, and we were living on a campsite, and it was gloriously hot weather. In fact, I was in a thunderstorm in the shower block, which had a tin roof, and it got struck by lightning just as I'd stepped out of the shower, and this electricity's dancing. These sparks are dancing all over the tin roof and on the taps. So probably if I'd been still in the shower, that would have been the end of Tony, but, somebody was looking after me. Anyway, I digress. I went to the pub there, and we used to drink. What did we used to drink? Brains, SA, special ale, which they called Skull Attack, or Velin Foil. It was Velin Foil, or as they called Feeling Foul, and we were drinking Velin Foil. Anyway, I was in the pub, and this guy talks to the other guy, and they obviously didn't speak much Welsh, and they decided to start speaking in Welsh because they were saying something like "Ma Wilbur yn y Cai," which is like one of the first phrases you used to learn at secondary school or junior school. Even there is a wheelbarrow in the field, and obviously I understood Welsh, so I thought that was amusing. And then on the other side of it, me and Tom got thrown off a bus in Swansea for speaking Welsh. He didn't want any Welsh speakers on the bus, so he threw us off. And I could tell you lots of anti-Welsh stuff. I worked with a lass called Eleri, and she went with her kid to the GP in Welshpool when I lived there. And they were Welsh speakers, so they were speaking Welsh. And some woman turned and went, "Speak the proper language, will you?" I don't speak Welsh. So there's all sorts of stuff there. And the only other time I was going to say was a guy called Adrian Price, who may even listen to this, and he's from Bryn Aman, I think, or Rhydaman, so Ammanford, Carmarthenshire. And we, for some reason, we were in a car. We crossed over the border to Pembrokeshire, and we ended up in this place like Cwm Garon, this tiny little pub. And we went in, and honestly, it was like the thing from American Werewolf in London. Everybody turns and looks at us, and they were all speaking Welsh. And of course, we were speaking Welsh, and Adrian spoke a dialect extremely close to their dialect, almost like me and somebody from Haltwhistle, very similar dialects. But they didn't like us there. But I don't think that was. I mean, we were Welsh speakers, so it wasn't an issue about being English. Fully enough, and then thinking about all the times I've been to Scotland. Obviously my biological father's Scottish, and we go to Scotland a lot. And the only time everybody in Scotland's fantastic with me, always, except we're in a chip shop in Dunkeld, fantastic place. If you ever want to go, so recommendations that you might not pick up from the tourist board. If you have a lot of time to spend in the UK and you haven't been to Larne in Carmarthenshire or Dunkeld up north of Perth, you want to go to both of those because they're both fantastic places. Anyway, so we're in this chip shop, and there was this family didn't like this. This guy is glowering at me, and I'm guessing the only reason was because I was speaking with an English accent, wasn't I? Except I don't speak like that. And if I did, so what? And then in Ireland, again, I never had any trouble in Ireland at all, apart from one time we were in a cafe in Drogheda, which is on the border. It's just south of the border between the 6 counties and the rest. And I've just upset a lot of people there. And this guy was getting a bit leery with us, but I should have spoken some Irish to him. But I didn't. Anyway, so there you are. This has got nothing to do with anything. And I've really just kind of rambled. It's just a classic folk horror story, isn't it? About the othering, the Celtic othering of these people, these unfriendly people in this dark valley. But it's a lovely part of the world. That whole part is the world. I remember one day I had to go to a meeting in St David's, I think, in Pembrokeshire. And it was a summer's day, and I had to drive back to where we were living at Pont Robert in Maldwyn, Trafaldwyn, you know, I can't remember the English name for it. Montgomeryshire. And I drove up along the coast into Cardiganshire, Ceredigion, and over through Machynlleth, I think, I maybe even went over the tops to Rhayader and Radnorshire and things like that, and then up that way. And I thought, there isn't a single part of this journey that isn't beautiful. So there we are. I have a great love for this island. I'm getting all emotional now, from top to bottom. So we're in Orkney a couple of years ago, and we're going to be in Cornwall this summer, down in Dorset and Cornwall. We're in Kent, and yeah, it's my home, and has been for thousands of years, you know, of my people. These islands, in fact, because my grandfather was Irish. But there you are. Anyway, there we go. And so Happy New Year, by the way, and thank you to Gavin. And there'll be more soon. Ta-ta tan-tok.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?